The band is back together as Ishiro Honda returns for 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, the titanic clash and one of the most successful Japanese films ever made, as we continue our look back at the history of Toho Toku films. And as we're going through the different movies, this is the next one on the list, King Kong vs. Godzilla, which is really in some ways an early version of a cinematic universe. Even though there are differences between this King Kong and the original version from 1933, it's still sort of a big versus battle that was culturally huge. I mean, I can't even begin to explain to you I don't even want to start this review, dude. Like, there's a lot going on here. And historic and legendary. I mean, we had Godzilla vs. Kong last year, and that film was in many ways borrowing a lot of concepts from this one, not just in the actual fight between Kong and Zilla, but also, how King Kong was portrayed. And it was all done to kind of redo that and try to get the same success because of how huge this movie was. So I want to go back a little bit. So let me explain something before we go into this review. People have to understand how big of a film King Kong was internationally. Even before Godzilla from 1954, in 1933, King Kong was totally, obviously a massive, historically, important movie, without question, but a movie that also captured the Japanese audience. Now, what would happen is the Japanese were enamored by this, giant ape that kind of has feelings for a woman, and he climbs the the building and all that. Like, all that stuff became iconic in Japan. And then we had Godzilla in 1954, the allegory for the nuclear bombs. But you have to go into this understand that the reason as to why this movie was so successful in Japan is because of how important King Kong was to them. Now, the good thing is that those involved with the film mirror the same people that were involved in the original 54 Godzilla. This is the first Godzilla film featuring Godzilla in years. Remember, they stopped using Godzilla and focused on Mothra and Rodan and other films. This is Godzilla's big return, and it's the first time that Godzilla had ever been in widescreen and in color in Japanese cinema. And like I mentioned, the band did get back together. Eiji Tsuburaya, more on him shortly, is back. And Ishiro Honda, the director of the original Godzilla film, he comes back to direct this film. Toho once again pushes it. And of course, music, Akira Ifukube returns again to score this film. So I watched this movie, and I had seen the English version. I never saw the original Japanese. There's a lot of myths about this film. One of the most popular ones that I heard when I was in high school is that the Japanese and English versions have two different endings, and that Godzilla wins one and Kong wins the other one, and that's not true. That is absolutely not true. Doesn't work that way. But there are some differences. But I'm going to focus primarily on the 1962 Japanese one. We're going to focus on that one here in this video. So the movie was, without question, a lot less serious than Godzilla Raids Again or the original Godzilla. Those films were really hammering home the danger of Godzilla. This movie does that, but at this point, the people who made this film, Honda and the rest of them, assume that you've already seen those movies, so you already know about the horrors of Godzilla. This is, of course, a sequel to it, but what they do here is they take King Kong and make him his biggest rival at the time. Now, I want to say, too, about this is that there's a lot of really strange things going on behind the scenes going into this film that you wouldn't even know about, but that don't make sense. Because when it comes to the King Kong lore, this version of King Kong, the Toho iteration of King Kong, is not the same we saw in the 1933 film. For example, King Kong in that movie was notably a lot smaller than the one in this film. This King Kong is pretty much equal height to Godzilla, but we know, based on looking at how the portrayal was of Godzilla and Kong in their original movies, that Godzilla is much bigger than the original Kong. So they had to kind of raise King Kong's height. On top of that, King Kong has this weird sort of semiconductor electrical power, and the reason for that is because originally, I believe that one of the early premises for this film is it was supposed to be King Kong versus Frankenstein, or King Kong meets Frankenstein. That was an early concept for this film, and Kong was supposed to get, or I'm sorry, Frankenstein was supposed to get woken up by electricity. So they took that idea when they actually came around to make this film and sort of switched it over and gave it to Kong. Now, the original King Kong, that never happened. That just never, he never had like the powers of electricity or anything like that. But in this film, he does have it, and I think the reason for that's because they had to give him something so that it matches up with Godzilla's atomic ray. Because in theory, Godzilla's atomic ray should melt King Kong. So they had to give him some kind of like, extra power to keep the fight more even. Now, the thing about this movie is, tonally, like I mentioned, even though it does have Honda as a director and it does have some sense of dread, it does not have the same tone as the original. This one's a lot more lighthearted. This one is cheesy and begins sort of the trend of Godzilla being involved in numerous versus films that wound up being more like big kaiju battles and sort of like what the Showa era would be known for. Giant monsters fighting and destruction, as opposed to this deep allegory about nuclear power and the threat of it. With King Kong versus Godzilla, it is not quite as overly comedic as like Mothra was, right? But it's also somewhere in the middle between Mothra and the original Godzilla. So the story here borrows concepts from the American King Kong film, but of course changes it. So basically what happens is we have the return of Godzilla, first and foremost. Godzilla was frozen originally in this giant wall of ice in 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. And in this film, Godzilla awakens from being frozen, and he is a threat to all of Japan, destroying, submarines and attacking military bases, heading for Japan. In the meantime, we find out about King Kong in this, he's on this island, and they don't even introduce him right away. They have a lot of like build up to it, and there's this, it's called Faroe Island, by the way. There's a giant octopus in the film that appears first. He's the third monster in this movie, and then later we find out that King Kong appears to beat the octopus. So they did that early to show the power of King Kong, but also I gotta say, and I'm gonna get into this more in just a moment when we talk about Eiji Tsuburaya's production, but I really love that squid creature, that octopus. We'll get to that here in a minute. So what ends up happening is the humans discover that, or they think they can use King Kong, sort of like what they did with Mothra. They can use King Kong as like a way to fight Godzilla and kind of have them, clash, and maybe he'll be able to beat him. Kong does fight Godzilla early in the film, but he's not strong enough. He realizes that the atomic ray is too much. So what ends up happening is the film kind of goes through two separate plot lines where you've got the humans trying to figure out how to control King Kong and Godzilla, stop them from destroying Tokyo, while at the same time being aware that these two are about to have a huge battle. So they have a lot of the ideas from the U.S. King Kong, like, for example, the fact he's on an island. There are natives that worship him. He fights other monsters early in the film, like what he did with the dinosaurs in the King Kong film. He obviously, has this weird, I don't know if you call it attraction or whatever, to a human woman, a regular-sized human woman. There's that. But some of the elements in this movie that I don't think were in the original King Kong, at least I don't remember them being there, is that the natives can play this sort of jingle to help him fall asleep. And that, of course, comes into play later in the movie when Kong does arrive onto land and the military gets involved. Now, one of my favorite scenes early on is the military fighting Godzilla. That was cool. I liked the way it was done in Rodan more, but that was great. And, of course, this all ends up leading to this huge battle with Godzilla and Kong at the end, which actually wound up being better than I remembered. I've only seen this film as a kid, and I vaguely remember seeing it, but I know I did. Now, after watching it again, I really enjoyed this fight because it's so wacky and over the top, like it's clearly two guys in a suit, and it's not trying to not be that, but they're sitting there and they're doing these moves like Kong will throw a rock at Godzilla. He'll bounce it back with his tail. They'll do grappling moves. Kong does like a judo throw. Like, they had a pretty good little fight. Like, it was a very entertaining fight. I'm laughing and I'm also into it. You know, it was a lot of fun. And unlike the original Gojira or Raids Again, Honda chose not to take Godzilla too seriously. You know, and again, it wouldn't be as cheesy or as corny as he would become in later Showa era films, but he was still not to be taken that much seriously. He just wasn't. That wasn't what they were going for in this movie, and it is what it is. Now, I really love that fight. I love how there's a scene where King Kong rips a tree and like sticks it down Godzilla's throat to stop him from doing the atomic ray. He also electrocutes him. They're just going at it, you know, and ultimately, neither one of the two actually like the victor of the film is sort of left ambiguous. In one way, it feels like maybe Kong survived, but people have to remember that Godzilla knows how to breathe underwater. He has gills, so because of that, it doesn't necessarily mean that he is dead. Like, you know, Kong comes up from the surface of the water, from underwater, and Godzilla's nowhere to be found, but that could be they both just went their own separate ways. There is no actual, quote, winner here. Even though you could say it's Kong based on that, there's more Godzilla films coming after this one, so because of that, we know that Godzilla did not die in this continuity. That being said, I want to talk a little bit about the production here. A couple things that I have to say were not good. There are some American actors in this film on this naval ship called the Seahawk or whatever. Maybe it was a submarine, I don't remember. The dubbing for these guys was bad. I mean, like, dude, and I'm watching the Japanese. I find it ironic that so many people make fun of how Americans dubbed the Japanese Godzilla monster movies, and yet don't even realize that when they were dubbing these English actors, these actors that spoke English, when they were dubbing it over to to English, they were speaking English for them, the lips didn't match at all. It was just like, I was watching it just kind of floored because they didn't even try to match it. It was really, really bad and really, really obvious. But again, it made me laugh because I can't take any of these things too seriously. Now, when it comes to special effects, the vast majority of the miniatures looked good. Some didn't. Some did not. I will say that. Some of the tanks looked like toy tanks. However, there's new miniatures used in this movie that Eiji Tsuburaya did not use before that are freaking awesome. There's a train at one point that King Kong lifts up. There's a building he runs into. There's also a temple that both Godzilla and Kong destroy. These things looked very authentic, very real. Obviously, even with Blu-ray, you can tell they're not, but they looked about as real as it got. And on top of that, I really feel like Eiji Tsuburaya, and I said this before, the dude is a pioneer of special effects in Japan, and he gets a lot of praise for Godzilla and Ultraman, but dude, in this film, he stepped his game up. He got better and better and better and better with each subsequent film, and you can tell in this one, because there's just new kinds of miniatures, new ways of editing. Like, for example, that train I mentioned, there's a scene where Kong picks up the train and it kind of gives you an angle from inside the train seeing Kong's eye. Total, like, awesome work there. Like, that stuff is, those kind of filmmaking tricks, nowadays it's all CGI, but in those days I really appreciate how even back in the early 60s they had to do what they could to kind of make things look as realistic as possible, and that for sure I think did a great job right there of doing it. On top of that, I love Godzilla's new suit in this movie. The way he's been designed, he's more buff, maybe not buff, but definitely more thick, and his dorsal fins are bigger. When he fires the atomic ray, this is starting to look a little bit more like his modern atomic ray. Not so much in colors, because in this movie, it was like a light blue clear, and you couldn't really see it as well. It wasn't thick. It wasn't like a thick, like, blast, like in future films, but his dorsal fins lit up. And that's what Godzilla historically, you know, even the Legendary Pictures version, his dorsal fins light up. There's that noise, right? They put that in that movie. In this movie, it doesn't have those noises, but the way that Godzilla looked was just, the lizard head was perfect. the suit. I love the suit in this movie. I love the suit. And actually, Kong's suit, there were a couple of angles where his face looked, I'll be honest, pretty damn hilarious. I'm not going to lie to you about that. It was cheesy, campy fun. There were other parts where he looked pretty good too. So I liked it. I liked Godzilla versus, or King Kong versus Godzilla. Not Godzilla versus Kong, King Kong versus Godzilla from 1962. There was also some stop motion stuff used here, some cut-ins. Not that many. Not that many. In fact, originally there was supposed to be King Kong versus Frankenstein. That was supposed to be stop motion. Never happened. So instead they went to this. They changed some things, you know, with what they would do. But Frankenstein did become a monster in another Toho film. We're going to talk about that in the future. But when talking about this one, King Kong vs. Godzilla is a cultural success. It's really the beginning of what we would call cinematic universes, seeing two different characters have their own movies and then clashing with each other, like what the MCU's kind of been done, and Universal Monsters did it too. In fact, I think Universal may have done it before this. I have to go look at the dates on that. I'm pretty sure that was before this, but nonetheless, for Japan, this is like a first. It was really... There were some parts of the film that I felt could have been kind of cut out. They could have paced better, but I had a great time watching it. It's a huge movie, huge film, and it's a movie that is iconic in many ways and began what I would call the versus era of Godzilla, where we started seeing more and more films after this one, Godzilla versus name your monster. And it all started with King Kong versus Godzilla. I mean, it's just something that you don't really see every day, and it's something that was really special back then. I can't even imagine what the Japanese thought about this. So with that being said, what did you think about Godzilla versus Kong? I'll see y'all here for the next edition of Toho Toku Theater. Take care.